Do you know what makes Muslims think and act the way they do? Well, in this session, we're going to discuss the sources of authority that influence the Muslims' thinking. And those include, first of all, the Sharia, or the law of God, and that in turn is derived from the Quran, or the book of God, and the Hadith, or the traditions of the Prophet. First of all, let's take a look at the Sharia. What does Sharia mean? Well, literally, the word Sharia means the road to the watering place. The word was used metaphorically to describe the clear path to be followed. As a technical term, it was the canon law of Islam, denoting all of the individual prescriptions or regulations that composed it. Islamic law has a theological background. Now, Islamic theology developed out of reaction to specific debates or issues associated with early Islam's socio-political context. That included debates between early Muslims and Christians, rather than as a product of reflection or the desire for systematization. So we could say that Islamic theology was more occasional than it was systematic. Now, Islamic theology came into its own during the Abbasid period, and its scope reflected interest in faith, politics, their interrelationship of belief and sin and eschatology, or the doctrine of last things, and legitimate governance. One of the key issues was the relationship of faith and works, and thus law became the primary religious science in Islam. The primary concern of Muslims is, what do I do? What is God's will and His law? And throughout history, Islamic law has remained central to Muslim identity and practice, for it constitutes the divine social blueprint for individual and collective behavior. Despite vast cultural and social differences among Muslims, law provides an underlying sense of unity, identity, uniformity of behavior, and oneness throughout the Muslim world. Legal rights and duties for the Muslim are in three major categories. First of all, there is duties to God. These comprise primarily ritual observances. Duties to self, and then duties to others. First of all, take a look at the categories of Islamic law. Now, we've said Sharia governs all of Islamic life, both the inner thought life and outward behavior. But it's divided into five broad categories. First of all, there are the beliefs. These are the doctrines that Muslims are obligated to confess and to acknowledge intellectually. There is the belief in one God, or Allah. There is the belief in His angels. There is a belief in His prophets. There is a belief in His books. There is a belief in His decrees. And finally, a belief in His judgments, or the last day. There is also a section or category of moral values. These are the obligations towards oneself. They would consist of personal restrictions such as not eating pork or not drinking wine. And then there are acts of worship. Those would be obligations towards God such as ritual worship, fasting, pilgrimage, and so forth. There are social obligations. Those would include obligations to others, which includes marriage and family law, commerce, government, international relations, and so forth. And then punishments. Those would be as stipulated in the Quran and the traditions. Those would include the law of retaliation, punishments for theft, adultery, fornication, slander, wine drinking, death for apostasy, and so forth. Not only are there categories of Islamic law, there are certain basic principles we need to observe about them. Schacht, for example, noticed several basic principles of Islamic law. First of all, the concept of Sharia flowing directly from the Quran itself. In other words, it comes from no other source. Secondly, God's law is not to be apprehended by human intelligence. It's to be accepted without criticism, in spite of apparent inconsistencies and incomprehensible decrees. Thirdly, the knowledge of God's law was originally obtained directly from the Quran and tradition. Therefore, no individual is qualified to adequately investigate these sources independently. The knowledge of Sharia is authoritatively communicated through a system of fiqh, or jurisprudence. Now, this is where the Muslim will diverge widely from the Christian, who holds that each individual believer is entitled to interpret the Scripture and debate the meaning of Scripture. During the early period of Islam, there was no uniformity of opinion as to the main duties enjoined upon Muslims. Special weight at that time was laid on prayer and almsgiving and fasting. Some also considered striving for holy war as a primary duty. The confession or shahada was often omitted altogether in discussion of religious duties. Shiites often distinctively held to recognition of the imamate, or the descent from the Prophet Muhammad as who rules over the community of Islam, and attachment to their imams was of great importance. In terms of the sources of Islamic law, prior to the 8th century, Islamic law could best be described as inconsistent and localized. At the end of that century, two major streams emerged. Those who brought uniformity to the legal system by restricting the use of reason and relying more heavily on the traditions of Muhammad, and then those who asserted the value of reason as a means of safeguarding equity and public interest. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi, who lived until about 819 AD, asserted two material sources of law and two means for application of that law. First of all, the sources. The first source is the Quran itself. Shafi said, while it does contain legal prescriptions, the bulk of the Quran consists of broad, general moral directives, what Muslims ought to do. Also, the second source, the Sunnah of the Prophet. Those were the sayings, the instructions, and the normative model behavior of Muhammad. Their authority is rooted in the Quranic encouragement, obey God and obey the messenger, Surah 4:59. In terms of application, analogical reasoning was one of the bases of application. That was a systematic form of legal reasoning which seeks a solution for new situations through discovery and application of analogous judgments from the Quran or the Sunnah. In other words, find something that compares or corresponds to the current situation. And then finally, the consensus of the community, the ulama. What began as a natural process of decision-making was later formalized into a process of agreement by the community of legal scholars or religious authorities, and so thus it was taken out of the hands of the average man. Now, Islamic jurisprudence also acknowledged other sources or influences on law, that is, custom, public interest, juris preference, or equity, but these were always subject to the primary sources. In addition to the sources, we need to consider the judgments of Islamic law. All behaviors under Islamic law are categorized in a number of areas. Number one, those which are obligatory, that is, those explicitly commanded in the Quran or the Hadith. Secondly, those which are recommended, things that might have been practiced by Muhammad but not clearly enjoined on his followers. Thirdly, those things which were permitted, that is, practice is not explicitly forbidden or disapproved in the Quran or by Muhammad. For example, if someone acted a certain way in the presence of the Prophet and nothing was said. Fourthly, those things which were disapproved, that is, things frowned upon by Muhammad but not explicitly forbidden. For example, divorce. And then, fifthly, those things which were explicitly forbidden in the Quran, such as associating partners with God or shirk, eating pork, drinking alcohol, and the like. We can thus see how the Sharia, or the law of God, governs activities in all areas of a person's life, whether they be personal, familial, social, or political. And that gives us a good insight into why Muslims think the way they do. We've talked about the Sharia, the law of God. We've talked about the acts of worship of the believer in Islam. Now we come to the source of authority for all of these things, and that is contained in the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran is the scripture of Islam. It is called the Noble Quran, the Glorious Quran, the Mighty Quran, but hardly ever is it called the Holy Quran except by modern Western-educated Muslims who are trying to imitate Christians who call their Bible the Holy Bible. It contains the substance of Muhammad's deliverances during the 20-odd years of his public ministry. And it's clear that he had been preparing a book for his community which would be for them what the Old Testament was for the Jews and the New Testament for the Christians. But he died before his book was ready. And what we have in the Quran is what his followers were able to gather together after his death and issue as the corpus or body of his revelations. Now, Orthodox Muslim theory holds that this material was all there, arranged just as we have it today in a heavenly archetype, from whence it was revealed by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad bit by bit as circumstances warranted, and then it was written down by scribes as it was proclaimed by Muhammad. It was collated by him and by Gabriel with the heavenly original, that is, to compare them, and then it was all ready for publication by the prophet's successors at his death.